Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Michael Hope, and we are talking about the second part of a book, The Mongol World. And he has co-edited this book, of course, The Mongol World, which I'm holding up, and that is the discussion of this whole episode. And because we've got quite a while, I think the best thing to do this set for this book, because it's, as you may see if you watch it on YouTube, it's quite big. And we barely scratched the part one of this book in the last episode. So I think the best idea might be to split this up in two parts. So there are three parts. So we ended up when we discussed the rise of the Mongols in the last episode, and we're going to begin with the splitting up of the Mongol Empire in this episode. But before we do that, we spoke with Timothy, about how he got involved in this project, and let's say it's from your side. I don't know what you think because you rub into his Batman. I don't hope the Jason Todd version, but but let's talk about what do you think there, and let's talk about your involvement, how he from your side, how you got involved in this book.
Yeah, I guess Batman, as he was getting older, he needed someone else to come in and do a lot of the heavy lifting and dealing
That's
with
always
villains.
the case, isn't it? And take the credits.
No, not at all. No. Yeah, no. Credit was deserved. No, I'm just being silly, but no, my involvement slightly sort of less dramatic. My involvement was when Tim invited me to come on board. Basically, as you covered in your previous episode, Tim was approached by Routledge to write this edited volume. We had met previously in Mongolia, and we had talked a little bit about our mutual interests, what we were working on. And so, yeah, I mean, I was, he sent me an email, I believe, and asked if I would be interested in working on this with him, and it's really a no-brainer. If Timothy May asks you if you want to write on the Mongol Empire, the answer is always yes. So yeah, we jumped on board, and from there, as he mentioned in the previous episode, planning out the different chapters, what kind of original intervention we could make, but also who we would invite to join in the program. I guess in terms of my contribution, I guess, and Tim as well, to some extent, we ended up playing as utility players, if you like, if we borrow a footballing metaphor. We had a lot of excellent people that came on board, and there were just a couple of topics that we either had difficulty finding people to write on, or we had people that had committed, but then for whatever reason, life gets in the way, and they had to drop out. And so certainly, I ended up writing on a lot of topics that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise, which was so it was a great opportunity for me to explore some areas that I hadn't looked into before. The Mongols in South Asia, in the Sultanate of Delhi, the Mongol diaspora, also the Mongols in Central Asia, the Middle Empire was another one that I've been very, very interested in. But this book gave me an opportunity to explore that. So I'm very glad he brought me on. But yeah, that's the extent of my or the story of how I got involved. Not much of a story, really.
And the rest of it's Mongol history, or Mongol world history, should I say?
That's right.
So,
That's right.
so we ended up last time, like I said in the start, we ended up with the rise, with the conquest of the Mongols. So let's begin with after the conquest, because unlike, say, Charlemagne's empire or Timur's empire or Alexander's empire, they didn't immediately split up like the other empires such on this scale, but eventually, of course, they did. But it took a couple of generations before. So let's begin with the aftermath of Chingis Khan and let's talk a little bit about the couple of generations before the split up of the Mongols.
Yeah, well, I suppose that one remarkable thing about the Mongol Empire that Genghis Khan had set up is that there is a really smooth transition of power from Genghis Khan to his designated heir Ögedei in 1229, where told by a number of different sources, Persian, Mongolian, also Chinese, that during his lifetime, Chinggis Khan had decided that Ögedei would be the best candidate to assume the throne. And I think it probably, to my mind, says something about the way that the Mongol Empire was organized and the type of personality that was required to run an empire this big. We're told by a number of authors, Giovanni is one of them. The Secret History of the Mongols also gives us a taste of this, that Chinggis Khan's sons all had very different personalities. During his lifetime, Giovanni tells us that they were all given different jobs to do in the empire. His eldest son, Jochi, was appointed as the head of the hunt. His second son, Chagatai, was appointed over the Yasa, this kind of body of kind of common law that had been built up around Chinggis Khan's ordinances and proclamations. Tului was put in charge of the army, and Ögedei was designated as his heir. We're told that on his deathbed, that Chinggis Khan told his successors and his relatives, his commanders, that if you want an easy life, if you want to have a smooth transition, then Ögedei is the person to appoint. And I think some of the stories about him we can see, when I first started reading about Ögedei, I guess to some extent I didn't appreciate the important role that he played in keeping everything together. Because, he's presented in some sources as being incredibly generous, almost to the point of being a little bit, careless in the way that he spends the money of the empire. He's a drinker. He likes a cup of pretty much anything that's going. We get the impression that his older brother Chagatai has to kind of step in and try and regulate his drinking habits. But one thing that we can
to be fair, that's the case with most rulers of the time. Though most of them are quite fond of alcohol.
Well, right, definitely. But the other side of that is it's this kind of banqueting culture and ritualized banqueting is one way to build networks, and it's one way to knit together a series of relationships or personal contracts that are based on oaths, that are based on sort of personal contact and trust, and so having that intimacy there is really important. And we're told that Jochi had died before Chinggis Khan, so he was not going to be considered. He was, not around to be considered. Chagatai is probably the next most logical option because he was the eldest, but we're told that his personality was just completely wrong for the job at hand. Chinggis Khan, throughout the course of his life, had built up a reputation for himself as, a remarkable commander, a state builder. The Mongols, as they would come into existence because of Chinggis Khan's achievement. He is one of the most remarkable leaders in world history. And so, by the end of his rule, what he says goes. But Ögedei didn't have that kind of cachet when he took over in 1229. He's not the oldest brother. He's not the oldest living relative of Chinggis Khan either. His military record, he had participated in some campaigns, definitely. But is it any more remarkable than anybody else, or more remarkable than any of Chinggis Khan's companions? No, not. There's no evidence of that at all.
So what was the challenges to Ögedei for taking the title as Khan, or was there, like you said, kind of hinted on was it a pretty smooth transition, or was there people that certainly wanted the challenging, but when didn't have the means to?
There is a hint in some of the Chinese sources that Chinggis Khan had appointed his youngest son Tului as the regent, or he was appointed as regent after Chinggis Khan's death, and that there are 2 years that passed from his death in 1227 until Ögedei took the throne in 1229, and there are some suggestions maybe that he might have been enjoying the job a lot. Eventually, Chinggis Khan's will is observed, and I think it really is the force of Chinggis Khan's will. People had been listening to him, following him. He led them on such a remarkable run of success that his will, his word became law. And so eventually he's followed. But it's also the personality of Ögedei himself. And I think, one of the best examples of this is a sort of a piece that Giovanni mentions, a story that he mentions comparing Ögedei to one of his brothers, Chagatai. They're out hunting one day, and there is a Muslim who is washing, he's performing his ablutions before prayers in a river. And now this is against the yasak. This is against Mongol law. You don't contaminate a sort of running water source because it's seen to pollute or sort of cause offense to the life force that occupies the river. It's sort of seen to have its own spiritual power and energy, and so you don't insult it by kind of cleaning your mess in the water or using it as a tip of some sort. So Chagatai comes across this Muslim washing in the stream as he's out hunting with Ögedei. He says, we've got to kill him. We've got to, he's broken the law. We should kill him. And Ögedei says, well, let's wait and we're all tired. Let's let him go, and we'll talk about this in the morning. We'll hold a trial for him. And secretly in the night, he goes to his officials and he says, drop some coins in the river. And then he sends the same officials to the Muslim and he says, tell them tomorrow morning that you dropped these coins and you were looking for them. You weren't washing in the river. So a trial is called the next day. Ögedei says, what are you doing in the river? The Muslim man does as he's told, and he says, well, I was looking for my coins. He says, well, this is easy to prove. Go and have a look, see if you can find any coins. And he uncovers some coins. And Ögedei says, we've made a terrible mistake. Let the man go. Give him something to compensate him, and he's done. I mean, what this story tells me, I know that Giovanni probably is making up some of this story to show that, yes, Ögedei is good to Muslims, so we should like him. But I think the other side of the story is that when you govern an empire where the Mongols become a minority very, very quickly, there's probably only about 1 million Mongols or something like that in the Mongol Empire. They're very quickly outnumbered by other groups, Chinese, Turks, Persians, other groups. And so you have this really complicated, cosmopolitan empire, and you can't rule it by just enforcing your own ideas, enforcing your own beliefs on these other people. And so Ögedei is able to build relationships. He is able to kind of keep the peace, not just amongst the people that he rules, but also amongst his relatives and amongst his father's companions. He can't rule in the same way as Chingis Khan because he doesn't have the same gravitas. But he is able to build these networks and to build up trust. And this allows him to make this much smoother transition. And from there on, he's able to achieve, remarkable success. In your previous episode, you mentioned some of what he achieves. There is the final conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. He conquers Iran. He finally defeats Jalaluddin, the son of Sultan Muhammad, the Khwarizm Shah. At the very end of his rule, Anatolia is gradually sort of coming under Mongol control. And of course, the Mongol invasion of the Kipchak steppe, the conquest of the Rus, it takes place under his rule. And he's able to do this by building these kind of bridges with his relatives and commanders. He wins buy-in. He holds these big Kurultais or assemblies of notables, and he gets people to contribute soldiers, resources. In some cases, people participate themselves. And this is how the Mongols move forward successfully to expand keep growing the empire. So that is Ögedei. If we're going to talk about why the Mongol Empire continues, part of it is the force of Chingis Khan's personality and his legacy. He does a lot of work building up a kind of imperial infrastructure, institutions that can outlast him when he dies in 1227. But Ögedei is also a very competent successor to Chingis Khan, and so he keeps the momentum going. I sort of think of the Mongols as being a kind of imperial enterprise where people buy in, and Ögedei is really good at getting people to buy in. And even some of the things I mentioned as being deficits, or I initially perceived as being sort of deficits in his personality when I was younger than I am now, this idea that he's reckless in his spending. He's redistributing resources to make sure that everybody gets a share, everybody wins out by joining the Mongol Empire. As we mentioned, with his drinking habits, he's schmoozing. He's doing what a good ruler needs to do. He's building confidence in his personal style of rule. So he is, and we can see this in other sort of tangible ways as well. When it comes to building a post system, for example, one of our chapters covers the construction of the post system. So that's something that has begun under Chinggis Khan's rule. The Mongols inherit a kind of network of postal systems in China, in the Middle East. There are roads inside some of the place and sort of communication systems that they inherit, but then none of them are connected, and certainly none of them are connected to the steppe. So Ogedei, this process begins under Chinggis Khan, but Ogedei sort of manages to sort of continue it. And the way that he does it is sending out to his brothers, sending out to his relatives, and saying, "Look, we want to build this thing. We want to knit together the empire. I'm going to build something in my part of that empire. You do it there. You do it there." And he needs to get buy-in, and he does it successfully. So part of it is Ogedei's personality, and his style of leadership. It's not tyrannical, despotic. It doesn't alienate anybody. He's really good at building bridges, and we can see this in it's reflected in some of the written sources that we have from the conquered population. They describe Chinggis Khan as being, I wouldn't quite say two-dimensional, but he is almost like a godlike figure, maybe a vengeful godlike figure who just rains down destruction and wrath on sinful people. He is a force of nature, or a kind of a, maybe we might and some would think of it as being an act of God. Ogedei is described in a much more human way. Some of these authors who haven't met him but have heard about him describe him as having these qualities of showing compassion to the people that he rules over. I know that in your previous episode you were talking about some of these authors that talk about the Mongol Khans going to hell. Even people that rule or live outside or right outside the Mongol Empire, someone like Juzjani, who's writing in the Delhi Sultanate, he has no reason to be nice about Ogedei, but he still says at the end of his rule, maybe he converted to Islam. We hear maybe he converted to Islam. If he did, then good on him. He's hopefully he has a less awful afterlife. Hopefully then he's rewarded for that. But it's interesting that even the enemies of the Mongol Empire are sort of listening to this and saying, "Oh, this guy's not that bad." There's a soft power that he exercises that's very, very successful. So that,
I think when your first perception of the Mongols, maybe if you haven't read any history at all, and you just know from TikTok videos or just Google or high school, whatever, history, whatever, is that they were these rapists, they were these conquest mad people. But if you read more academic work, and if you read actually more Mongol history books, that's not as it's talked about Ogedei. I think that's not. You find that's not the case at all. You're sure somewhere, probably a little bit rapey or mad and conquest. Really, really fond of conquering, but there's more to the Mongols than and we'll talk about this, of course, later on. It wasn't all that bad to live in the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, I mean I think that is the system that Chinggis Khan built is one that is easily able to assimilate new people into their governing system. So the Khan's bodyguard, the Keshik, plays a really big part in that. People who are newly subdued or have submitted to the Mongol Empire, they have to send their children to come and serve in the Khan's household. They serve in his bodyguard. There are sort of leaders of Tibetan monastic orders who have to send their relatives to serve in the Khan's bodyguard. The rulers of the Korea, where I am at the moment, they have to send their children to come and serve in the Khan's bodyguard, and they have to after they sort of complete their internship, if you like, or they complete their service, they return back to their wherever they come from. They come back as I suppose active participants in and inheritors of this new kind of imperial culture. We read about some of these Tibetan sort of princes that come back and serve as governors over parts of Tibet. They sort of speak Tibetan with a Mongol accent. The Koryo return back dressed as Mongols with Mongol haircuts. And they have to go back to the Khan's court periodically, at least every sort of 2 years or so. And at least for the Koryo, but also for a lot of other rulers, it's not really like it is an obligation, but it is also an opportunity to come back home and catch up with your old sort of childhood friends, the people that you grew up with in the Khan's bodyguard, are now sort of sharing in the administration of the empire. And so it's good to keep these people on
A high
side.
school reunion of sort.
It is, yeah. I mean, there's definitely there's a ritual element to that. They show up, they have to present tribute, they have to reaffirm their allegiance to the Khan. But then, for the Koryo at least, they go out hunting. They show up to these banquets. They get very very nicely. They drink a lot. Let's put it that way. They drink a lot. They have a good time. They catch up with old people. And this is true for a lot of rulers in the Mongol Empire. So this helps to knit together this group. I know that the Mongol conquests, of course, are interesting because they're sexy. If you sort of want to talk about the rise of empires, we always think of empires as being one group imposing power over the other by force. But some of Chinggis Khan's greatest achievements are achieved without it fighting a battle. The Uyghurs come under Mongol rule without, an arrow being shot. The Uyghurs just see the way the winds are blowing. They see that there is an opportunity for them to consolidate and perhaps even grow their power inside the Mongol Empire. And so the Idikut, the ruler of the Uyghurs, comes and submits to Chinggis Khan voluntarily. The same is true of the Karluk rulers of Al-Malik, and there are a number of these other rulers that voluntarily come over to join Chinggis Khan. So yeah, there are, and I think in your last podcast with Tim, you were talking about the conquest of Central Asia. An awful lot of it is won over simply by building good relationships. The Oirats, in sort of to the west of Lake Baikal today, in eastern Siberia, they also come and submit to Chinggis Khan voluntarily. Huge swaths of land, many sort of tens and even hundreds of thousands of people probably enter the Mongol Empire because their rulers just think that there is a chance for them to keep power and maybe to advance their position. The Mongol Empire brings protection for a lot of these rulers. It's not seen as necessarily as being a kind of a hostile sort of foreign power. It's in some places, admittedly not everywhere, and maybe this is not the experience of the majority. I don't want to kind of undersell that war is sort of the main way that the Mongols expand, but an awful lot of it is brought under Mongol control peacefully. There's a saying when Hulagu is about to capture Baghdad in 1258, one of his Persian advisors, Nasiruddin Tusi, tells him that there is a saying that you can conquer a place from the saddle, but you can't rule it from the saddle. You can use violence to conquer a place, but you can't use violence to rule it. And that certainly seems to have been understood by Ogedei. Yeah.
Now, I think we talked about this last episode as well, but there is this conception, and of course, medieval sources in Europe certainly believe this, but it is when Ogedei died, there's a certain perception that Europe was saved because of his death. So, is there truth to this, or is there other reasons? What are your take on the fact that they were saved by the Khans, that Europe where they should have gone on, but they were saved by the Khan's death. And is there a certain truth to this, or is that just mostly exaggeration?
I think, maybe there is some truth to it, but perhaps the greater truth is that the Mongols start bickering among themselves before they have the opportunity to advance further on into Europe. Even during the Great Western Campaign, as it's described by some historians, which sort of begins in 1236 with the conquest of the Kipchaks, moves through the Rus principalities in 1238 to 1240. They move into Eastern Europe after that. Before the Mongols enter Eastern Europe, there had already been a kind of a split in their army. There had been a dispute between some of the leading princes. I mentioned before that Ögedei ruled by building consensus. He builds by winning the support of a lot of his relatives who buy into the imperial enterprise. So the army that he sends westward against Europe is ruled by a whole lot of his relatives, or it's led by a whole lot of his relatives. One is his nephew Batu, the son of Chingis Khan's eldest son Jochi. Another division is led by his own son Guyuk. Another is led by another nephew Buri, the son of his elder brother Chagadai, and Mongke, the son of Tului, also shows up on this campaign. So all of the main lines of Chinggis Khan's sons, even his uncles, are represented on this campaign. Now the problem is that they don't get along. They get along with Ögedei, but they don't get along amongst each other. And so even before the Mongol army enters Eastern Europe, before the Battle of Mohi, before the Mongols encounter the Hungarian Empire or kingdom, beg your pardon, the army has, half of them have already departed. Guyuk falls out with Batu at least a year before the Battle of Mohi. He takes his soldiers and he just turns back. He returns back to Mongolia, and probably Mongke joins him as well. It's a huge controversy. There is. We're told in the secret history that Batu writes a formal complaint to Ögedei. He complains that your son has just kind of abandoned the army. You can only imagine what kind of trouble this caused. Ögedei promises that he's going to punish his son. Whether he actually does or not is another question. He seems to be still on his journey back before any punishment is handed out. But the army's already split. And so this is perhaps the first breach. Of course, Ögedei's death and Guyuk's succession to Ögedei also make any further campaign westward sort of doubly doubtful, because Guyuk, sort of based on his earlier argument with Batu in the west, doesn't trust Batu. Batu doesn't trust Guyuk. Guyuk was supposedly planning another campaign against the west. He had amassed an army, and he told his relatives to do likewise. He was marching westward when he died in 1248. So, there are signs that the Mongols were still planning further attacks westward. My own view is that this so-called Western campaign is actually directed towards the Islamic world and not Europe. But nevertheless, if the Mongols weren't so busy sort of worrying about their own concerns, maybe they're able to present or deploy their resources differently. But certainly after the division of the empire in 1259, the Mongols are too busy camping armies against each other's frontiers or fighting one another to dedicate sort of armies to a further invasion of Western Europe. So yeah, I guess on one level, yes, Ögedei's death to some extent saves the empire, but I think that the divisions that had already taken place amongst the leaders of the Western campaign made it, this always seems to have been on the cards. But it has to be said that the Mongols did continue to expand well after that. They conquer the southern Sung. They conquer Baghdad. They conquer the Jazeera, the area around Diyarbakir, in what is nowadays southern Anatolia or southern Turkey. Under the reign of Mongke, they make advances into South Asia. Most of modern day Pakistan falls under Mongol control during the reign of Mongke. So they certainly don't stop expanding after Ogedei's death. Perhaps the bigger question is why they keep expanding on every other front except for the European one. I think that's probably a more curious question. And whether it is that they view the natural march into Europe as going, through the Eastern Roman Empire, or whether they prioritize the Islamic conquest over the European one, I really don't have I don't think anybody has a really clear answer on that one. Of course, historians have proposed that maybe there's not adequate pasture land, or maybe there is some other kind of natural barrier to the Mongol invasion of Western Europe. The Europeans are building some of the most formidable fortifications and castles that can protect their rulers and their cities at this point. So there is speculation about that, but I don't really see any of these arguments as being convincing. The Mongols are adaptable to almost any type of warfare. In their conquest of the southern Sung, they adapt to maritime warfare. In your previous podcast, you were talking about their adaptation to siege warfare. They do adapt and assimilate new technologies. They assimilate new tactics very, very quickly. And again, they are a minority in their own empire. They tend to achieve great things because they're able to either co-opt or to convince their subjects to join their ranks. And so the idea that the Mongols can't use, Russian troops, Turkic troops, Seljuk troops to try a new invasion of Europe, I think, I think they probably could. They don't, but why not? Certainly, the Europeans are paranoid about it. Alexander Meyerov, who has contributed a chapter on the Golden Horde, makes the point that, or touches on the issue that at this point in history there is a conflict between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor, and both sides suspect the other of collaborating with or conspiring with the Mongols. And
The
so,
papacy actually does, though, and we will get back to this in the next episode, I think, but the
mhm.
papacy actually does collaborate with the Mongols.
Well, there's maybe not as effectively. I mean, there's signs that Louis IX of France is very keen to build some kind of a connection with the Mongols, mainly for the purposes of crusading. It never quite works out. Edward I also is proactively trying to seek, for the same reason, for further crusades in the Middle East, is trying to build something with the Mongols. It never quite works out. But there are people that are willing to work with the Mongols as they're moving further westward. There are reports to the papacy that again, the Holy Roman Emperor is meeting with Mongols in the far east of his empire. Again, Professor Meyerov has suggested that in some cases this is hype, and that maybe there are Russians also that are dressing as Mongols to make it themselves look more scary that they might otherwise be. But Europe is no more unified or sort of resilient, I wouldn't have thought, than any of the other places that the Mongols conquer. It really is just it's a very puzzling sort of question, but I think it's a number of different factors. Certainly, the internal politics of the Mongol Empire play no small part, but also I think, prioritizing other theaters of war would also be a factor in that. Yeah.
So let's talk about the split up, or I'm not sure partition is the right word in this case, but I'm using it to try to simplify. So let's talk about the road to partition of the empire and how they split up of the Ilkhanate and later Qublai's one empire and
Yeah.
the Golden Horde and the other empires of the Mongol steppes that say that and talk about how that happened and
Mm.
the eventual split up of the Ilkhanate of the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, so yeah, you're quite right. Sort of to not talk about it or be careful about the way you talk about it, because this is an area that's contested by some historians nowadays. But yeah, as good as Ogedei was at knitting together the empire, he died in 1241, and the third generation, if we can call them that, of Mongol rulers after Chinggis Khan, Ogedei. The third generation finds it more difficult to collaborate and to cooperate.
It's not an immediate split up
No, it's
after
not.
Ogedei. It's like you said, it's a couple generation of the Chingis Khan that
Yeah.
actually before it
Well,
happens.
well, it's. I mean, it really is the third generation because you have there are three rulers of this generation, right? There's Ogedei's son Guyuk takes over after him, but he doesn't stay on the throne for very long. Less than 2 years, he rules. We're told that he was somewhat sickly. Sort of maybe this fed into his personality. He's a bit of a dour ruler, or at least that's the way that Franciscan envoy Carpini described him. But in any case, he didn't rule for particularly long time. And after his death, the question of the succession arises again. And it's a controversial question. Should one of Guyuk's sons succeed? None of them have really done much in the Mongol Empire to sort of make a name for themselves. They have obviously control of their own armies, their own people. They have an alliance network that they inherit from their grandfather and their father. But I think the big problem is that. Guyuk's wife, Urulkamish, is not very good at organizing her relatives. Her sons, for a long time, fight amongst themselves or disagree amongst themselves. One of their cousins, Shiramun, also has a claim to the throne. The one thing that they can agree on is that the throne should stay in their line of Chinggis Khan's successors. But their cousin Mongke, who had joined Guyuk in the Great Western Campaign, is also considers himself to be a candidate. And his mother, Sorhaktani Beki, positions him so that he is able to assume the leadership of the empire. And she does this by building an alliance between her son Mongke and Batu in the west. William of Rubric, sort of when he talks to the Khans, he sort of, I think it's Mongke, says that he and Batu are like two eyes in the same head. They're they have the same vision, but they are kind of separate in that regard. But anyway, she helps to bring together these two cousins, and they hold a Kurultai, an assembly of notables in Kaalik, which is in, I suppose, near modern day Almaty and sort of modern day Kazakhstan. It's in that area around the Ili River region, close to the border of China. They organize their own Kurultai, which is controversial because all other meetings had taken place in Mongolia. And so, the descendants of Ogedei, the descendants of Chavadai, some of them at least are sort of questioning, well, what's going on here? They send delegates to Batu who pleads that he is unwell, and so he can't make the full journey to Mongolia, and so they must come to him and visit him on his own turf, if you like. Anyway, they all show up. Most of the descendants of Ogedei and Chavadai leave and say, we'll delegate authority to our own representatives, and they go back home. But Batu decides to award the Khanate to Mongke, who he sends back to Mongolia with armies, and they seat him on the throne in, what myself and what some other historians have described as being the Tuluid coup. Basically, anybody that doesn't show up and accept his leadership, gets killed. He arrests the sons of Guyuk. He arrests most of the adult male members of the Chavadite and Ogedei lineage. He sends death squads. into northern China, into Central Asia, and they just round up people that might be suspicious or are seen to have sympathies with Mongke's rivals, and they are put out of commission. They're killed or they're arrested. And so Mongke sort of seizes power in a way that Ogedei, doesn't need to, because he's just so likable and charismatic. Mongke is not that person. He imposes control over the empire, and for a period of time, the descendants of Ogedei and Chagatai, they sort of have a share in the empire, but no real control over it. It is Batu and Mongke. They sort of control the east and the west. Mongke also uses this opportunity to deploy his brothers. He sends Qublai into northern China. He sends his other younger brother, Hulagu, into the Middle East to assume control of these two very important populations and the wealth that they represent. So this consolidates his control of the empire, whilst also continuing to expand the empire in both directions. But yeah, when Mongke died in 1259, again, the throne is contested by his brothers. So again, this third generation sort of struggle to establish themselves. Each one, I mean, sort of to maybe dig down a little deeper into what is going on. The Mongol Empire is ruled after Chingis Khan like a family concern. The resources, the people, the territory, the animals, the officers, the revenues are divided amongst the imperial family. And so Ogedei is kind of forced, I mean, he rules in a kind of conciliatory way. But he probably needs to, because the resources of the empire have been divided in this way. Now, what this means for subsequent generations is that a lot of other princes have a power base on which to launch their own political careers and maybe make a bid for power. Some are better off than others. Most try to form a kind of cluster of princes in an alliance network, or a party or a faction or something like this. But this is kind of the way that the empire works. After Mongke's death, the two biggest constellations of princes surround his brothers, Qublai and his youngest brother, Arik Böke. Qublai, as I mentioned, had been sent to northern China. Arik Böke had been appointed as his regent in Mongolia. Mongke died leading a campaign against the southern Sung Empire in China, probably from cholera. But he was on campaign when he died, and Arik Böke was at that point in Mongolia. And it seems at first that Arik Böke might have been the most popular candidate. A lot of Mongke's relatives, including some of his sons, supported Arik Böke. A lot of his old household staff, his old guard, supported Arik Böke. Even some of the relatives to the west, Batu's brother Berke, who had taken over the leadership of the Kipchak steppe, seems to have supported him. Hulagu maybe also supported him for a period. We know that one of Hulagu's sons was in Arik Böke's suite, his kind of household, from 1260 when he claimed the throne. It's only around 1262, 1263 that he recalls this son and maybe switches sides to Qublai. But seems like Arik Böke is the first choice. But Qublai just sort of refuses to show up to a Kurultai to affirm his brother's leadership. He stays in China. He rallies the armies that had been sent to conquer the southern Sung, and he uses them as a sort of power base to resist Arik Böke's leadership. And the empire is plunged into a war between 1260 and 1263, when Arik Böke formally surrendered. He doesn't come in person to surrender until 1264, but for the better part of 3.5 years, the empire is plunged into a civil war, and it's not clear, who's going to win for big parts of it. Other parts of the empire in Central Asia become theaters of a kind of proxy war, where Qublai and Arik Böke try to appoint their own candidates to rule over this territory, to try and reinforce their claim to authority. But eventually, Kublai wins out. He is able to strangle Mongolia, basically. He takes his armies, and after conquering some territory in around the Gansu corridor and further west in East Turkestan, he is able to sort of cordon off Mongolia and just sort of impose a vice-like grip upon it. Erik Buke is forced to flee into Central Asia, where he's eventually kicked out and is forced to submit. But yeah, the empire that Kublai then inherits, having been divided in civil war for so many years, is perhaps his authority is truncated in comparison to Mongke. He doesn't have the same kind of direct power that Mongke had. And part of this is because, again, during the Civil War, he's forced to make compromises to keep his relatives out of the war. Erik Buke's candidate to take control of Central Asia, a prince named Algu, a descendant of Chagatai, initially supports Erik Buke, but when he imposes heavy taxes upon him, Algu switches loyalties over to Kublai, who guarantees his control of Central Asia. His younger brother Hulagu, likewise, probably recognizes very early on that he really doesn't stand a chance. He receives word of Mongke's death whilst he's in Syria, in Aleppo, in 1260. Several months have passed since Mongke's death, and the chances that he's going to be able to march his army all the way from Syria back to Mongolia to make a serious challenge for the throne, forget about it. It's impossible. And so he sort of bows out and tries to consolidate his control over the Middle East instead. And Kublai, again, is willing to confirm him in that position in return for his acknowledgement that Kublai is now the great Khan. Eventually, even the Golden Horde comes around to accept this state of affairs during the reign of Berke's successor, Mongke Temur. So Kublai is still acknowledged as the Khan of the Mongol Empire. It's still thought of by most of these princes as being one single entity, but in practice, there are too many disagreements between these princes. Certainly, to launch a kind of a single unified attack on places like Western Europe or the Mamluk Sultanate in Syria, or even the Sung Empire, this proves a little bit too difficult for them. But there is still acknowledgement that Kublai is kind of the primus inter pares, that the Ilkhanate still, or the Hulagu's descendants still seek confirmation for their rule from him. The rulers of the Middle Empire, the descendants of Chagatai, also seek his affirmation to rule. And so there is still this idea that, the band has split up, but they could potentially get back together to organize something later on. Now, the reason that describing this as being a split is controversial is because there is this ongoing sense of them being a unitary empire. Hulagu's descendants still have a claim to revenues in China and in Tibet. The descendants of Batu also have similar claims to titles and properties in the east of the empire. Likewise, the descendants of Chagatai and Ögedei, they still draw on these revenues. They still, as I say, sort of willing to accept delegates, envoys from the Khan and to recognize his authority. They use seals that are sent by the Great Khan in a lot of their sort of correspondence and their sort of in the secretariat. So there is still this idea of them being a single empire, but yeah, it's not what it was under Ögedei, certainly. Yeah.
So let's begin then with China and talk about Kublai Khan's establishing his capital in China. And I don't remember the name of the city, but as we talked about transitly, the Mongols are known to adapt, and we spoke about this quite a lot in the last episode. But we see this as well when it comes to religion too, that they adapt incredibly well to the circumstances that they and Qublai. So we made an episode with Maurice Rosabi. I mentioned in the last episode, of course. I'm thrilled to see that he wrote a chapter in your book as well. And but the Mongols were master. Kublai certainly were master of adapting the into the Chinese tradition, and of course they would still conquer China, the Song Dynasty and Korea, and attempt to conquer Japan. I'm sure we will talk about this as well. But when even religion he tried to adapt, and his dynasty, the one dynasty that he was established, had also had a more Chinese tone to it rather than Mongol tone. And I want to talk a little bit about this from my understanding, of course. I see you nod in your head there, but so I'm sure we'll get into that. But his mother as well is, as far as I understand, was the historian Christian. So let's talk about Kublai's one dynasty and the Chinese Mongol Empire.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the reason I was kind of giving a mischievous smile and maybe a tilt of the head is I guess this idea of him being a Chinese ruler, I think is or not a Chinese ruler, but him sort of adapting. He certainly does, like any good empire. The one of the key motivations for building an empire is that you take advantage of the resources, the expertise, the manpower of the places that you're going to conquer. And so it's only natural that when the Mongols conquer northern China and then southern China under Kublai is virtually captured by 1276. There's still mopping up operations until 1279, but effectively by 1276 the game is up. But Kublai is like his predecessors, is adept at integrating his Chinese subjects into his administration. They're employed as tax officials. They're employed as advisors, as secretaries. Religious leaders, as you mentioned, are also brought on board as well. But I guess what I would say to that, though, is that Kublai builds a new imperial culture. And when I talk about an imperial culture, I mean it in sort of the broadest sense. It integrates, as I say, the best bits of the what the Mongols have to bring, but also what their conquered subjects have to bring. Kublai does, as I say, borrow from Chinese experience and manpower, but he does the same thing in Tibet. He does the same thing in Korea, and still there is this idea that the Mongols are on top. They never really kind of give that up. And so while certainly the written evidence for what we have, there are a lot of Chinese sources that do present this idea of the Mongols as being part of a broader Chinese imperial tradition. The Iranians do a very similar thing as well. The Tibetan sources do the same thing, though, I sort of. So I guess what I would say there is we need to be a little bit cautious when we kind of sort of think of the Yuan as sort of entirely relocating to China, and I don't think that's what you were saying, but I'm sort of pushing back maybe on this older tradition that exists, and it's born out of, I suppose, the way that we compartmentalize sort of the study of the Mongol Empire. If you study the Yuan, then you're usually trained as a sinologist. You're sort of trained to learn, you learn Chinese. You sort of go off and study Chinese history, and then the Yuan sort of fits very neatly into that. But it's not clear to me that that's the way the Mongols see
Is it
themselves.
partly Chinese propaganda in a way that Kublai was this adapted completely into Chinese culture to make him more Chinese than Mongol?
Yeah.
Is that partly propaganda?
I think so. Well, look, I think it's a two-way street. I think the Mongols are very good at convincing people that they're kind of
We
uh,
like you.
yeah, well, we're the ones you've been waiting for. I mean, the last episode, you were talking about the Mongol conquest, and I think one thing that all of the Mongol successor states do, the Mongol invasion is treated almost universally as being an epochal event. That is to say, it brings to an end one period of time, one cycle of time, and it's seen as being the beginning of a kind of Armageddon. That doesn't mean the end of the world, but it means the end of one type of period of time and the beginning of a new one. Maybe it's the last phase of existence before, the Judgment Day or what have you. Maybe it is a new cycle or a new era, if you like. Gold Age, Bronze Age. Stone Age, Bronze Age, and then Mongol Age, maybe. There's so the Mongols are really good at telling the Muslims, after the destruction, everybody is waiting for the new Messiah. And the Mongols are very good at saying, that's us. Actually, that's, we're the new saviors. And I think Kublai does that in China as well. He manages to convince enough people that that's what he's doing. We have some records from the, from Buddhist authors that sort of will present him as being the sort of reincarnation of these kind of old, either old Buddhist gods. In some cases, he's described as being a kind of form of bodhisattva, or a model for the Dharma. He's described as being a Chakravartin king, so a kind of pious, just protector of the Dharma and the Sangha. He convinces everybody that he's what they've been waiting for. But the part of the problem we have is that after the Mongols are defeated in 1368, maybe we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves now, but the end of the Yuan dynasty, the Yuanshi is written. It's pushed out very, very quickly. There is this sense that Mongol rule is done and that the Ming Empire sort of succeeds to their control of China. But, Mongol rule continues in Mongolia. The Yuan dynasty doesn't disappear from Mongolia. And so if we were to date the Yuan dynasty from the beginning of the point where Kublai claims to be, or makes his claim to be, the great Khan in 1260, traditionally, some Chinese historians would say that, that the Yuan Empire ends in 1368 when the Ming push the Mongols out of Dadu, or modern-day Beijing. But that's not really right. They hang around. Mongol rule is still acknowledged in places like Dali, in modern-day Yunnan, in East Turkestan. It's still acknowledged in Mongolia after that for several centuries afterwards. And so if we think of China as being a component in a much bigger Eastern empire, then maybe I would hesitate to say that they're too Chinese. But it's a two-way street. The Mongols are trying to convince the Chinese are trying to convince the Mongols. Anyway, so Kublai takes over control, and the city that you were talking about, so Shangdu, is in Inner Mongolia. So again, part of what is nowadays the People's Republic of China, but Inner Mongolia, this autonomous region. Shangdu is I guess it's about 7 hours drive north of modern day Beijing, and this is a town that Kublai founds during the reign of his brother Mongke, when he is sent to administer some of the provinces of northern China. We're told that he also sort of includes Chinese officials in his inner circle to help advise him on how to govern the provinces that are being given over to him, that they help him impose a kind of predictable I suppose, tax system on the places that he governs to try and minimize strain, but also population displacement or alienation. So Shangdu is sort of part of this project, or this little fief that he builds for himself in northern China. But it's I guess a good exemplar of the new imperial culture that the Mongols build, because it's neither in, it's within striking distance of Beijing, but it's also still technically on the steppe. It's constructed in the best traditions of, this kind of the idea of feng shui. There's this idea of the qi passing through the city to increase good fortune and so forth. But at the same time, the design of the city is capable of expanding and contracting because it is a seasonal residence. It's not a kind of a static capital city where the Mongols spend all their time. Qublai travels there during the summer because the steppe is far more temperate and much cooler during the summer than Dardu. If anybody's been to Beijing during the summer, I know that when I visited Dardu myself, I flew into Beijing and then I was driven up from Beijing to Chengdu. And I asked the driver. I said, how do I know when we've reached Inner Mongolia? And he just said, you'll know. And Beijing at that point, it's kind of the rainy season, very cloudy, very overcast. And then all of a sudden the clouds disappeared and the sun came out and the weather dropped. It was very pleasant. I said, "Were you there yet?" And he said, "Yeah, we're in Mongolia now." So you can see why he would go up there. But so it is a kind of mixed city. It's built for the nomads to show up. It's got space for them to keep their animals. It's a modest sized city that must have swollen to 10 times its size any time the Khan showed up. But it does make these concessions to, again, the Chinese population they rule, but also other populations as well. So yeah, perhaps that's a good exemplar for the kind of culture that Qublai tries to build. He takes a Chinese dynastic name. Again, he employs Chinese secretaries into his administration. But in most cases, it's the Mongols that are at the very top of these administrative positions. So he sort of divides the administration of his empire. He has his own sort of personal household staff, which responsible for administering or sort of commanding the army. He has his own secretariat, which is responsible for building or controlling the civil bureaucracy or the taxation system. And he also has a censor, which kind of polices activity in the provinces. But each of these three organs of government, the senior leadership, are made up of Mongols and Turks and Muslims, and in a lot of cases just non-Chinese. Basically, the Imperial Academy at this sort of periods for his rule, there are times under the Yuan where it's led by Koreans, for example. It is a very diverse place, and so even a lot of the Uyghur officials, they take on Chinese titles. They sort of embrace all of that the empire has to offer them, but certainly not an assimilation by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, Qublai, as I say, continues the campaign begun by Mongke. He subdues southern China. By that point, Tibet had already been brought under Mongol control during the reign of Ögedei. Korea, or the Koryo dynasty, also submitted to the Mongols at the end of Mongke's reign.
And there are even marriage alliances between the Koryo and the Kublai's family as well.
There are lots of them. I think it's 8 of the Koryo monarchs in total marry, I think, something like 12 princesses, beg your pardon. So the vast majority of them have Mongol wives. Again, Tibet is integrated into this system as well, and so is Eastern Siberia. Again, the descendants of Arik Böke are actually kept. They keep their old patrimony, which is sort of the area between the Selenge River up to the Yenisei River. Again, the area, I guess, from around Novosibirsk up to Lake Baikal and a little bit beyond is sort of the descendants of Arik Böke also stay in power there. So yeah, it is a vast empire that he inherits. I guess the problem that Qublai and his descendants have is that he's so incredibly successful in building up his power in East Asia. Qublai is remarkable because he rules for a much longer time than most of his relatives do. Other than Chingis Khan, Few people rule as long as Kublai. As I say, he dies in 1294, so that's a reign of about 34 years. It's a remarkably long period of time. And very few of his successors can live up to him. He's sort of a larger than life personality that it's very difficult to replace. During his rule, he briefly designates one of his sons, Jingam, to take his place, but Jingam predeceases Kublai, and so that is no longer on the cards. But his son, in return, Temurul Jetu, is eventually designated as his successor, and so he takes power after Kublai's death in 1294. But he's certainly not as successful as Kublai is. Kublai, like Chinggis Khan, rules through force of personality. He has a reputation that he has earned over the course of his career that makes him sort of well respected, and people listen to him. The successors to Kublai, Timurul Jetu is one. His successor, Haishan, is another that's identified by in our book. They have to spend a lot more money to buy support. They grant more concessions to win support from their relatives, but also from their commanders, from the that are sort of controlled armies that can be brought to bear to help them rule the empire. And so, gradually, over the next few decades, there is a kind of alienation of power and resources from the center of the Khan's court. And by the end of Yuan rule, at least in China, the Khan controls very little outside of the capitals of Dadu and Shangdu. Shangdu is actually kind of attacked and burned by the Red Turban rebels at one point. So that even control of Shangdu is sort of being questioned before the Mongols are kicked out of Dadu. But so Kublai is irreplaceable in some ways. It's the empire that he builds is sort of, as I say, an interesting one, and one of the more interesting. I mean, they're all interesting chapters, but I think one of the best ways to round off sort of the discussion of the Yuan is sort of this chapter written by Chu Yi Hao. He talks about Kublai establishing the idea of the Great Unity. This idea that is picked up by the Ming, that Kublai reunifies China for the first time in about 3 centuries. It's a very important achievement, and so there is this kind of renewed sense of what it means to be Chinese under Kublai. And whatever happens after at the end of Yuan rule in China, the Ming still feel like they need to sort of placate or to satisfy this achievement, or live up to this achievement of Kublai. All future emperors have to achieve this similar great unity to rule all of China, not just the north or the south or bits of it. You have to unify the area that is brought under Kublai's control. And so even the Ming sources are pretty charitable in their treatment of Kublai as a ruler. They all try and live up to him. It's his descendants, they think, that sort of bring down the system through their corruption and their sort of extravagant lifestyles, their decadence, and their immorality. Yeah.
So let's move on, and of course we talked a lot of details on Kublai in our episode in North Rosabi. I would highly recommend checking that one out. But let's move on to the next Khanate, which is I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about the Ilkhanate. We spoke a little bit about them by the end of last episode, and I said that it's kind of ironic that the Islamic world and the Wahhab sort of kind of looked at them as Judgment Day and said that they would brought the end of the world, and then that they were an abomination of sorts. But then it's kind of ironic that they would later adapt to Islam as their profound religion. And you said earlier that it is clear that they were more focused on the Middle East rather than Europe. And again, we see this clearly, and we spoke about this before as well on our episode of the Mongol Storm, how they mainly focus on the Seljuk Sultanate and the Middle Eastern empires such as Trebizond and like you said, the Mamluk Sultanate. So it's clear that the Ilkhanate's focus were mainly on the Middle East and not Europe were less important to them. So let's talk about the Ilkhanate and the creation of the Ilkhanate and how Islam would become their choice of religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, this is more my territory. I tend to focus more on the Islamic western end of the empire than the east. But yeah, I mean, interesting that you sort of raised the point that they. I mean, yes, on one level, it is curious that they're sort of seen as being. Yeah, this sort of this destructive apocalyptic force in some of the early literature, and that they then convert to Islam. But I guess the other way of looking at it is that they solve the problem that they create in some ways. I mean, there is this gap between the first Mongol invasion of Iran. The Mongols cross into Iran in 1220. And then Hulagu, who founds the Ilkhanate, he's sort of sent west by his brother Mongke, as I mentioned before. By this point, most of Iran has already been conquered during the reign of Ögedei. And so Hulagu is sent with three objectives. One is to conquer the Nizari Ismailis, or the so-called assassins, who have a series of fortresses based around sort of northern Iran, but also some in Syria and in Lebanon. Hulagu is also charged with the conquest of Baghdad. And finally, the subjugation of the Kurds. Tim mentioned, I think, in the last episode that he was a bit surprised that the Kurds are responsible for killing Jalaluddin. Maybe, but Kurdistan is a huge area. It's a very powerful area as well, and clearly the Mongols thought it was worth Hulagu spending a lot of time in bringing them under control. It's an area that crosses from the area around Diyarbakir in southern Anatolia all the way down the Zagros Mountains. There are some sources at this point that describe it reaching nearly as far as the Persian Gulf. So it's a huge area that commands tremendous sort of resources in terms of manpower and military strength. In fact, it's one of the sources for soldiers in the Abbasid Caliphate. One of their leading commanders is of Kurdish stock and has very close relations with Kurdish tribal leaders, sort of in the area around Erbil. The Mongols also need to cultivate relations with the Kurds as well. So they are also a very important group. But yeah, it does seem a little bit odd that Jalaluddin is sort of murdered in the mountains. But again, the Kurds are certainly not no slouches when it comes to this kind of thing. Anyway, there is a kind of intervening period between 1220 and when Hulagu is sent to conquer these areas at the outset of Mongke's rule. So he begins, he sort of conquers the Ismaili fortresses in 1256. So there's roughly 35, 36 years between the first Mongol invasion and Hulagu's arrival. And in the intervening period, there is a crisis. The Mongols come in. They cause tremendous devastation, much more. I mean, the conquest of Central Asia, as I said, is in many places, it's peaceful, or at least, there's not as much destruction. The Mongol conquest of Khorasan is tremendously destructive. Lots of people get killed, even more probably get displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people probably are sort of caught up in this. And the Mongols then withdraw. They do the same thing in Russia. They come in, they kind of cause tremendous upheaval, destruction, and then suddenly they disappear. They go, they return back to Central Asia, and for a while, people are left scratching their head, thinking, what on earth's just happened? The Khwarezm Shah state has been completely undermined beyond redemption. Towns have been destroyed. Their population's been evacuated. Not only political but religious leadership is absent as well. And so within this 30-odd year period, you see the rise of I hesitate to say heretical, but in some cases, millenarian religious leaders claiming some kind of prophetic or messianic status. And each one of them is disappointing. Different authors have different solutions to this problem that the Mongols pose. We're told by Kyriakos of Ganja, the sort of Armenian cleric and author, that there is a figure that appears in Greater Armenia. I think his name is something like Andrew or something like this. And he starts performing miracles. He claims to be a great sort of miracle healer, and that he holds some kind of special again, charismatic status in the absence of any Armenian clergy who have all either fled or been killed. He kind of fills the void. And in Central Asia as well, in Bukhara, there is a sieve maker who claims to be some kind of special intermediary with God and the spirit world. He can commune with these kind of hidden jinn and angels who come down to fight his battles on his behalf. So there's this kind of spiritual upheaval as well as a social one that is brought.
There's always one, isn't there?
There's always one. In this case, they're everywhere. And so mainstream writers like Ibn Athir, who was the first author to describe the Mongol invasion. Juvayni is kind of another one looking for solutions. Nasawi, who Tim mentioned in the previous podcast, they're all trying to figure out, who is going to save us from this. Nasawi thinks it's going to be Jalal-ad-Din for a while. He pins his hopes on the idea that Jalal-ad-Din is going to reform a new Islamic sort of hesitate to use the term, but a kind of a new resistance or state. They're going to unify the Muslims. They're going to stop all their petty bickering, and they're going to join together to fight off the Mongols in a great holy war. But Jalal-ad-Din is damaged goods after the first Mongol invasion. He's probably suffering some form of PTS. He falls into drink. He shows signs of madness, and it's no surprise by the end that he is kind of abandoned by a lot of his supporters. And so, he ends out getting hunted down by the Kurds near Amul in Diyarbakir. But Ibn Athir has another idea. He thinks that that there are no good political leaders in the Islamic world. He thinks that the Abbasids are corrupt. He thinks that the Khwarezm Shah is even worse. He kind of warns his readers that this is what you get for putting your faith in these kind of profane leaders. He encourages them to look to Islam, and that there needs to be a spiritual guide or spiritual leadership to revive the Islamic resistance against the Mongols. But in short, everybody is waiting for a kind of an imam or a new kind of spiritual leader who is going to unify the Muslims and get them over this terrible kind of chaotic situation that they are in after the Mongol conquest. George Lane, again, who's contributed the chapter on the Ilkhanate for us, his argument over a number of his books has been that the Mongols are the solution to this problem, that it is a Qadi or a sort of Islamic magistrate in the city of Qazvin who travels to the court of Mongke and says, look, we're really suffering here. There is no proper leadership. Please send someone to fix the situation. And so George Lane says that Hulagu doesn't arrive as a conqueror. He arrives as a king. His procession into Iran is slow, casual, because he knows he's coming into an area that is willing to receive him. And so for many, but after this 30-year period, there is this willingness to accept anybody that can impose some kind of stability on the region, and the Mongols are the only ones that are strong enough to do it. They're naturally, ideologically, they are sort of at loggerheads with the Abbasid Caliphate and the Nizari Ismailis. Neither of these two powers, neither the Ismailis nor the Abbasids have the power to impose political control over the area. The Abbasids control most of southern Iraq and also Arbil, but Mosul is outside of their control. There are under the Caliph Nasruddin, there are sort of attempts to revive the power of the Abbasids on a broader scale, but this really fails with his death. And Al-Mustansir, the caliph in power when Hulagu arrives, is a complete wastrel. He's sort of universally condemned for failing to make adequate preparations to meet the Mongol invasion. The Nizari Ismailis likewise have a crisis of leadership, but in terms of their belief system, there's a clash between two universal ideologies, the Islamic and the Mongol, and neither one can tolerate the other. The Mongols are, I suppose it's sort of best put, I think it's the historian Vasov sort of mentions that in his correspondence with the Abbasid Caliph, Hulagu threatens him and says, "You need to come and submit to me." And the Caliph Al-Mustasim says, don't you know who I am? How can you hope to capture a star? If I may have a small army on paper, but if I put the word out, then all Muslims will rise up to oppose the Mongols. And so, whilst this is probably a completely unreasonable appraisal of his strength, Hulagu can't tolerate having an ideological rival. And so he has to deal with both of these groups, and he does. But it leaves this void of leadership, religious leadership, that the Mongols are able to fill. And without the Abbasids, without the Ismailis there to police sort of the way that debates, exchanges of ideas, knowledge production, when the Mongols are sort of building up their own networks amongst the both Sunni and Shia scholarly elite of the Middle East, there is this freedom of expression where people can come out and propose new ideas about religious leadership. And the Mongols happily sort of step into that void and assume that position, not just as Muslims, but as leaders of a kind of Islamic revival, or at least this is the way that they would like to present themselves as kind of the new, not just political, but spiritual leaders as well.
There is, and sorry for interrupting you, but we spoke briefly about this in our episode on the Mongol Storm, another episode I would highly recommend checking out. But we spoke briefly the one that, and I think we talked about how the Mongols and the Seljuks, especially, they're both from Turkic origins, so it's easier to adapt to Islam in that way. That both the Seljuk and the Mongols had something in common, coming from this Turkic race, that they kind of felt they were. I don't remember the word for it. They had a connection, perhaps, in the sense that they are both from the same race, that they descend from the same race. So is that perhaps a reason why it was easier to adapt to Islam for the Ilkhanate?
I tend to think that probably the most convincing explanation that I've heard is, and I think that probably plays a part. There are kind of Turkic interlocutors that play a role probably in helping to convert some of the Khans, but there's less evidence for that. There's perhaps circumstantial evidence, or we can assume that plays a role. But for me, the most convincing recent scholarship on this topic has been done by Jonathan Brack. And he talks about this meeting of the minds in which Rashid ad-Din really plays a big role. I mean, Rashid ad-Din's most famous for his Jamia Tavarikh, his universal history that he writes for... First, he writes for Ghazan, and then his brother Ul-Jaytu in 1308. But he also writes far more on on theology. He writes a whole series of texts, it seems, in conversation with Ghazan and his brother Ul-Jaytu on the nature of religious leadership. And Jonathan Brack has kind of identified, or he kind of talks about the Mongol religious or kind of cosmology, one based on immanentism, this idea that the Mongols expect to see some kind of indication from the Godhead that they are in favor in this life. There is no kind of deferred gratification. There is no sense of, well, we'll suffer in this life and wait for the next life where we get our reward. No, God shows who he favors in this life right now. And we can see that in the correspondence between the great Khan Guyuk and Pope Innocent IV. When Pope Innocent IV tries to convert Guyuk to Christianity, Guyuk writes back and basically says, who are you? Like, you're kind of the ruler of a small, city state in Europe. I've never heard of you. Like, there's, I rule most of the known world. If God's on your side, you'd be in my place. God's clearly on the Mongols' side. So you should come to me and accept God's word from me. You should accept the Yasa. And so I think that the point that Jonathan Brack makes is that the Islamic thinkers under the Ilkhanate and certainly under the leadership of Rashid ad-Din very quickly come to sort of realize that just forcing dogma on them is not going to work. And Rashid ad-Din manages to present a version of Islam that accords with the Mongols' view of the world much more closely. And this idea that the Khan is a kind of manifestation of God's will on earth, it really accords quite closely with the Mongol idea that the Khan is the son of heaven, that Chingis Khan is being protected by Mongke Tengri. He just couches it in Islamic language. And so it makes it very easy for the Mongols when they don't have to compromise any of their existing beliefs. They can just sort of naturally sort of accept what he is presenting. And it ticks all the boxes for them. I mean, we have these other cases, William of Rubric is sent by King Louis IX to go and travel to Prince Sartak, the son of Batu, because he hears that Sartak is a Christian Mongol, and so maybe he can help them. And he's kind of really taken aback because, Sartak is probably a Nestorian Christian. But when William of Rubric shows up, Sartak tells him, "Stop calling me a Christian. I'm not a Christian. I'm a Mongol." And what does that mean? It probably just means that in Sartak's view of things, Christians are a subject population. Any religion that doesn't say that the Mongols are number one, they're not going to accept. And Rashid ad-Din sort of recognizes this, and he presents a version of Islam that is more palatable to the Mongols. So I think that's probably, for me at least, I think that's sort of the most convincing explanation of what's going on.
Now, the final for this episode, the final Khanate that I want to talk about. Of course, there are others, but I don't think we have time to go through everything. Unfortunately, of course, if you want to go in much more detail, I mean, you should absolutely read the book. It's a fantastic read, and if you want to go much, as I said, we're going to split this into 3 parts just too simply. It's not enough time to cover all of this. So let's talk about the Golden Horde then, and as a final subject of this episode. So let's end this episode on the high note and talk about the Golden Horde.
No problem. Well, yeah, and again, do cut me off if I'm going too long on any of my answers, or
no worries.
Okay, right. Well, I mean, yeah. So the Golden Horde, or I mean, it goes by several names in the sources. I mean, Golden Horde, it's really sort of more of a modern invention now. Most of the sources will the Islamic sources will talk about the Kipchak Khanate, or sometimes they'll talk about the Ulus of Batu or the Ulus of Berke. But what we're really talking about here is the Jochid Ulus, or the state of, or the realm of the descendants of Jochi, which it stretches from the Irtish River in the east, or what is nowadays, I guess, the northeastern sort of border of Kazakhstan and Siberia, again, as far west as the Danube River. I guess it's sort of some people would say that it is a legacy of Chinggis Khan, who divides the steppe up amongst his relatives. His brothers receive the area sort of from the Hulunbur lake area eastward, whereas his sons Chagadai, Jochi, and Ugade receive the area to the west of Mongolia. Jochi, we're told in this.
If I may, what
Mm.
is the Golden Horde what eventually become the Crimean Khanate until the 18th century, or is it a different thing?
No, that's so the Crimean Khanate is sort of one of the successor states of the Golden Horde. So there's one of the Jochid princes, Haji Haji Bey, I think his name is sort of the founder of this new sort of state based out of the Crimea. Is one of the successor states, the Kazan Khanate, the Kazimov Khanate, Astrakhan, the Uzbeks also are sort of successors to this, the Kazakh Khanate, the Nogays are also sort of successors to the legacy of the Golden Horde. Yes, so they are definitely one of them. Yes, yes, but that sort of really takes place after the things start going awry. But yeah, it's from the Irtysh River sort of westwards. Chinggis Khan sort of says, well, as far west as the horse's hooves can carry you, and they go pretty far west. But I mean, again, similar to the empire itself, it's divided up amongst the sons of Jochi. So Batu, his second son, takes the west and is based along the Volga River. Another son, his eldest son, Orda, is based in the area between the Irtysh and the Jaxartes or the Sirdarya River. And it seems like the other princes, the other brothers, are kind of divided up between the leadership of these two main groups. Others may receive portions. We have sort of evidence, for example, that another brother, Noge, inherits even further west to the area around between the Danube River and the Dnester River. It's also seems likely that another brother, Shaban, inherits an area around the Ural River. So it's divided up amongst the brothers. But yeah, the Volga River is certainly the main center of power. Batu and the rulers who control the camps along the Ural River tend to dominate the other brothers who control this area. Yeah, I mean, Batu dies during the reign of Mongke, is succeeded by his brother Berke, who is the first of the rulers of the Golden Horde to convert to Islam. We mentioned before that there is sort of not sort of push to conquer Western Europe. Berke and his successors do raid into Eastern Europe, into Southeastern Europe, into the Balkans, even pushing or applying pressure to the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire at various points. So they are still active there. It's just that they're not trying to permanently impose control over these territories, but large swaths of territory, as I say, including most of the modern day Ukraine, parts of certainly Romania, even Bulgaria has this kind of client relationship where their kings marry into the Khan's family. Their sons have to go and serve in the bodyguard of the rulers of the Golden Horde. Noge has sort of a certain sway over the rulers of Serbia. So the Mongol footprint in Eastern Europe is much bigger than the area immediately under their control, certainly.
We discussed this when it comes to Kublai. He focuses on China and East Asia, right? And Ilkhanate, they focus on the eastern Middle East and Middle Eastern world, and the Ilkhanate, of course. Sorry, the Golden Horde. They seem to be focused on the Russian and European. Like you said, they didn't focus on conquering much, but they just maintained on focusing their
Mm.
tribute from the Russian territories and the where was the capital of
Mm.
the? What was it in Crimea, as we would like to see with the Crimean Khanate, or did that come later?
No, so yeah, I mean, Crimea is certainly important. It's an area of trade and shipping. It's important. It links the Golden Horde across the Black Sea to not only the Eastern Roman Empire, what's left of it in Constantinople, but also it connects it to the Mediterranean, to its political allies, the Mamluk Sultanate in Syria and in Egypt, where they sell most of their slaves, or it's at least certainly the ones that are not internally sold. Yeah, as I mentioned before, the main center of power is on the Volga River. And again, I think it's maybe a sort of a slight, maybe a slight misconception. I think the same problem that we have for the yuan, where we focus too heavily on the Chinese because that's where a lot of the sources are written. We probably have exactly the same problem in the Golden Horde with the Ruthenian chronicles that we read, most of which are produced very late on in the 16th and 17th centuries as kind of copies of copies of copies. But yeah, the real center of power is on the Volga River. So this is the old center of power for the Khazars. It is the old center of power for the Kipchaks before them. And the Kipchaks are play a huge, immensely important role. The Turkic-speaking people of the Kipchak steppe play a hugely important role in the history of the Golden Horde. I mean, they're probably, out of all of the Mongol uluses, the four that we sort of mentioned, they're probably one of the earliest to shift from sort of, in terms of their chancellery practice, incorporating Turkic at least in sort of as one of the main languages of the court. Kipchak Turkic as a sort of dialect sort of continues to expand rapidly under Mongol rule, and variants of Kipchak Turkic are still spoken, by again the Tatars, the Bashkirs, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz. So this is a pretty important group, and it because of the way that the river systems operate in, or the direction, their trajectory in the west of what is nowadays Russia. It's a north to south trajectory which orients the trade of the Volga River, of the Ural River in a southerly direction. Also, the Sir River, it's sort of directed to the Islamic world, and so yeah, the heavier perhaps cultural influence on the Mongols in these areas is probably from the Islamic world. It's from Persia. It's from again the former Khwarezmshah Empire. Urgench, the capital of the Khwarezmshah Empire, is incorporated into the Jochid Ulus. It's probably its second most important city after Sarai, which is sort of the seasonal capital that is established by Berke and then sort of later on re-established by Özbek Khan, who also converts to Islam and most likely lends his name to a certain successor state that passes out of the Golden Horde, but definitely the orientation is to the south. It's to the Turks. Again, that's not to minimize the role of the Rus in the Golden Horde. They contribute soldiers, tax, things like this. But I wouldn't say that they're more important than these Turkic populations by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, again, as I think you mentioned in your previous episode, the shared life ways of the Turks, this kind of transhuman, sort of nomadic pastoralist way of life, probably makes it easier for them to adapt to Mongol rule, at least faster than the Rus do. But even the Russian rulers of a lot of the city-states, including Moscow, adapt to Mongol rule in their own way. I think it's, in the 19th century, I think it's about 1/5 of the Romanov aristocracy trace their descent back to Mongols who come across to join the Duchy of Muscovy under the leadership of people like Ivan III and, of course, Ivan the Terrible. They sort of incorporate a huge Mongol population. There is a sort of a suburb in Moscow that is given over to Mongols who sort of see it as a pretty nice place to settle. Moscow's wars against Poland, Lithuania are often led by Mongol generals, and when it is time for Ivan IV to finally scuttle off this mortal coil, he passes on the throne to a sort of a Mongol prince who's converted to Christianity and joined his forces. Boris Godunov is a Mongol prince who comes over to Russia and sort of finally sees out the Dutch, sort of Muscovite rule before Michael I founds the Romanov dynasty. So yeah, Russia as well integrates itself into Mongol leadership, albeit that it's not always well reflected in the Russian chronicles. Charles Halperin has, of course, written widely on this phenomenon of the Russian chronicles often deliberately forgetting or selectively forgetting bits of their history under Mongol rule. Shout out to Charles Halperin, who's probably my favorite or one of my main idols when I was studying Mongol history as an undergraduate. One of my small life's ambitions was to become more like Charles Halperin.
I'm just gonna skip a few hundred years of history there while I write my chronicle. Just a little
Sorry?
bit of amnesia for the 200 years while I write my chronicle of Russian history.
Right. Yeah, there's a few bits that are well, I mean, yeah. So I mean, the way that again, I think Charles very accurately describes it. I mean, the Russians are not writing universal histories in the same way that Rashid-ad-Din does. Their perspective is very very much rooted in the cities that they're based in. They're mainly written kind of monastic chronicles, and so again, it's telling the story of these of Christianity, of these Christian rulers of the Ruthenian principalities, and then eventually their crusade, basically to fight off the pagan, by this time Muslim Mongols, and this is really what sort of Russia is founded upon, this kind of reconquest or conquest actually of the old Golden Horde and the conversion of these sort of pagan territories into Russian Christian territories, and this perhaps kind of imperial ideology then feeds into Russian expansion across the Ural Mountains, into Siberia, into the Kazakh steppe, and sort of, again, it's a sort of very useful ideology right up until the 19th century. But yeah, they forget quite a bit. But yeah, in the meantime, we do have alternative sources. That we have, of course, some of the other successor states to the Golden Horde, not least the Uzbek Khanates founded by the descendants of Shaban Khan, the Shabanids in what is nowadays Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. They write their own histories as well, very different to the ones that the Russians are writing. No less problematic, because of course, whereas the Russians are biased towards Christianity and the spread of that particular religion, the Shaybanids also see themselves as being champions of Islam, and so their perspective is prejudiced in a slightly different direction. But nevertheless, it gives us a sort of a useful antidote. Some of the most useful material that we have on the Golden Horde, though, is written in Persian and in Arabic, because again, this is the direction that they are oriented in. It is the language that is spoken by many of their senior court secretaries. And it's the language that, again, the Persian authors in the Ilkhanate are writing in. And so these universal histories sort of tend to be written in these Islamic languages. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of there are large gaps, and because the history of a lot of the Golden Horde is often being written by outsiders, we get sort of garbled, probably half truths about some of these Khans. Tode Mongke, one of sort of Berke's successors, is either said to have gone mad or to have had some kind of religious apotheosis, and so he abdicates the throne and is then replaced. Towards the end of sort of the Golden Horde, I mean, the thing that really brings it down and also collapses the Ilkhanate and the Middle Empire is probably the plague. Sort of beginning in 1346, we see tremendous instability across all four of these uluses. And from that point onwards, if you read the Uzbek chronicles, the reverence with which these rulers are treated suddenly diminishes. We get accounts of rulers being murdered. The description of their reign is what I've described in some places as being kind of the Mongol version of Suetonius's 12 Caesars, in the same way that Suetonius tries to kind of highlight the abuses of imperial rule in an attempt to push them back towards republican government. A lot of the early Timurid and early Uzbek authors write about the late Golden Horde rulers in a very similar way. They're degenerate, sort of, they're happy to kill off most of their relatives to seize power. They're constantly having affairs, drunken affairs with their officials' wives, which also gets them murdered. And the rate of Khans that
just a normal court then.
Well, yeah. In some ways, yes. I mean, the murder rate is.
It wouldn't be a normal court without a little bit of soap opera drama.
Well, that's very true. That's very true. Yes, yes. But something has changed because murder is probably far more common than we give it credit for in the demise of many Mongol rulers. But the difference is that most chroniclers have the tact not to mention it. They kind of don't want to badmouth someone who's deceased. By the end, nobody cares. They're all just saying they're all as bad as each other. Good thing that they're gone, really. And this probably marks the end. Even though the Khans are still being sort of put on the throne, it seems to be that people have stopped taking them seriously, and power is shifting, or the nature of power is shifting across Central Asia. Yeah.
Now, before we round up this episode, we spoke a little bit about this again in our episode on Qublai Khan with Morris Rosabi, but what were the relations between the separate khanates? Because we spoke about this, and it didn't seem to be very good relations between the separate khanates, because of course everyone probably wanted to be the khanate and the khan that everyone were supposed to look up to. But so let's talk a little bit about the relation between the separate khanates before we round up this episode.
Sure. I mean, so yeah, it's not great, as you say. I mean, probably again, Lamsren Monk Erdene has written a very good chapter on that helps us understand the relationship between these Khans. He sort of talks about princes of uluses, or rulers over people, and this is the way that most of these successor states probably view themselves as having a legitimate claim to rule over a certain population. The problem is nobody can agree which population they really control, and so it's disputed. The one thing they do all seem to agree is that Qublai is the great Khan, but outside of that, and even that, is patchy at times. But outside of that, the civil war that breaks out between Mongke and Arik Boke is played out in other places. As Hulagu, as I say, he tries to consolidate his control over the Middle East because he doesn't stand a chance of becoming Great Khan. So he just takes as much territory and as many people as he can get his hands on. The problem is that his cousins on the Kipchak steppe feel like they've got an equal claim to this territory. They helped conquer Iran. They helped send soldiers to conquer Baghdad and Anatolia. Batu is receiving letters from the Seljuk princes treating him as kind of the Khan's deputy in the West throughout most of the 1240s and 1250s. And so there is a kind of sense that they're being cheated. And so there is a dispute that breaks out between Hulagu and Berke in 1262. They fight what is probably the most bloody war that Hulagu fights throughout his career, and that's saying something. Back and forth across the Caucasus, their armies sort of trek and fight and die between 1262 and 1266 when Berke dies. A similar campaign is being fought on the eastern front of the Ilkhanate, where likewise Berke's forces are contending with the armies of Hulagu's son Abaka for control in that theatre. Again, Batu and Berke are seen by many, probably in Khorasan, as being having as equal a claim to their loyalties as Hulagu, and so they fight. And this is a fight that, on and off, is fought until 1356, when the armies of Janibeg Khan enter Tabriz and finally succeed in imposing Jochid control over that city. But by that point, the Ilkhanate has already started to fall apart, and very soon the Golden Horde does a very similar thing. The Ilkhanate has similarly problematic relations in Central Asia, again, because there's no clear demarcation. When Mongke dies, there's a grab for power, and you take what you can get. And Hulagu manages to grab quite a lot. Berke grabs quite a lot. And there are losers in this kind of scramble for power. The descendants of Chagatai, the descendants of Ögedei are amongst, and the descendants of Arikboka are also amongst this group of losers. And so, the problem that the Chagatais, that the Ögedeids face is that they don't only have limited control of resources and people, but they have no natural outlet to conquer new territory either. They, like the Jochids, also feel like they should have inherited part of Iran. They feel like they should also have a claim to some commonly held cities in Transoxiania. They want a natural outlet for their energies, which they see in the 14th century as being India. The Sultanate of Delhi becomes the main target of their attacks. But yeah, they contest these new arrangements, these new divisions. They fight against Hulagu and his descendants, but they also fight against the Jochids as well. They fight against Qublai. They feel like he's too overbearing, that he overreaches in some cases. After sort of 1303, the descendants of Chagatai do their best to reconcile themselves with the Yuan, and we're told that the Yuan Shi tells us that Quebec, one of Dua's sons, the new ruler of the Chagatais, sends so many diplomatic tribute missions to the court of the Yuan that the Emperor Temurul Jaitu has to post a permanent guard to stop them sending these envoys, because they keep showing up with gifts and then expecting gifts in return, and the Khan thinks they're taking liberties, so he sort of says, quietly, just piss off, but yeah, on and off, they contest control over East Turkestan, over the Tarim Basin. There is sort of contested control of the Altai Mountains and of eastern Siberia as well. So this division is never really comfortable. It is sort of constantly being contested. And part of the problem is that it seems, and I think this is maybe a conclusion that our chapter doesn't reach, but I think is the logical conclusion, that when you are a prince of an ulus, or the leader of an ulus, a group of people, you're actually in control of a constellation of minor princes who sometimes change their allegiance to other princes, or whose values don't always or priorities don't always align with that particular Khan, that particular lord.
But Jen,
Yeah.
To interrupt you, that's not entirely common when it comes to alliances generally throughout history.
Mm.
You see that it
Yeah.
shifts all the time. Like one day you can, for example, say be allied to the British Empire and the Habsburgs, and the other you have allied with
Mm.
Germany, Prussia, or Russia, or
Mm.
France. So
Mm.
alliance
Mm.
to do one comparison. So alliances change all the time from
Yeah.
depending on the situation you were in.
Right, right, absolutely, absolutely, and the Mongol Empire is no different. So that's yeah, I think that's an apt comparison, and that's certainly doesn't help in a lot of these flare-ups. It's things like this that cause an issue. But that's something that I think maybe if we're looking for where we go from here, that's a direction perhaps for further research. Yeah,
I hope
yeah.
so. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We try to see if we can get both on for the next part. That we live in three different time zones and three different parts of the earth, so it might be tricky. But before you go, of course, do you have any social media? And again, where can people buy your book, The Mongol World? And absolutely go to talk next time about how women in the Mongol world, like we talked about earlier, we're going to talk about envoys to the Mongol Empire, and we're going to talk about the postal system as it more in detail as you touched about, and other fun and fantastic stuff that you may not have thought about in when it comes to Mongol history. So I'm absolutely stay tuned for next week when I go to the third and final part of this book. And of course, if you can't wait until in the meantime, you should absolutely begin to read this book because it's such a great work and a cornerstone on Mongol history that it should be essential reading when it comes if you're interested in the Mongol history and Mongol society. But let's before you go, of course, do you have any social media you want to share or anywhere people might find you if they have further questions about Mongol history or what we talked about today, or anything else you want to share? Any other work you might be interested in sharing with us, or links you wanted me to share in the description? Now it's a chance to do so.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. It's always been a pleasure to chat with you on the Mongol Empire. I think in terms of sort of research work, most of my stuff is uploaded onto academia .edu. So certainly you can sort of check out some of my work in more detail there. But yeah, yeah, that's probably the main place to keep up with me.
Thank you again so much for coming in. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. I'm looking forward to do part three next next week, I hope. And this has been With That Aged Well. My name's Alan. You can find us on social media under Instagram, Twitter, or Blue Sky under Well That Aged Well. I still call it Twitter. I refuse to call it by its other letter. So we are also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, please give us 5 stars. That would be very nice. Or if you hate this podcast, you can always give us one. It's at least where I live. It's a free world so far. But I don't know where you're listening from, but it is where I live. If you're on Apple Podcast, consider writing a review. That would be great. I love reading and finding new reviews on Apple Podcasts. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Do you have a favorite Mongol Khanate you'd want me to cover more, or any other part of Mongol history you may want me to cover more? I try to read a comment and see what I can do. And of course, you can also leave us a comment on Spotify as well. But again, you should absolutely check out the Mongol World. It's a fantastic read. It's big, but it's well worth your time. So thank you so much for coming on again. This has been With That Aged Well. My name's Alan, and I'll see you next time.